Hey, in this video, I'm going to talk about carbohydrates. Carbohydrates is definitely something you've heard before, but maybe you've never really thought about the word carbohydrate, what it means. The carbo refers to carbon, and the hydrate tells you that it's hydrated. So you can think of it like hydrated carbon. It's like adding water to carbon. So you would expect carbon and hydrogen and oxygen, and they are in a ratio of approximately 1 to 2 to 1, meaning like 1 carbon atom for every 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom. And that's the empirical formula for all carbohydrates. So even long branched chains that are carbohydrates, if you reduce them to their empirical formula, you'd find it's 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. And you probably already know that carbohydrates function to give us quick energy, immediate energy. They're also part of the structure of organisms, especially in plants where carbohydrates make up the cell wall. You might remember that cellulose is the cell wall. Cellulose is a type of carbohydrate. Also in animal cells, when we looked at the cell membrane, you might remember learning about glycolipids and glycoproteins. Well, that prefix glyco refers to the carbohydrate, and you might recall that is involved in cell-to-cell recognition. That pattern of glycolipids and glycoproteins is used to identify a cell. So cells can use that to bind together, to make tissues. Also, if your immune system looks at that pattern of glycolipids and glycoproteins and doesn't recognize it, then it would take that cell for a foreign cell and go about trying to attack it. And you probably also heard the term simple carbs or complex carbs. So let's look at what that actually means. Simple carbs are monosaccharides. Mono means one, and so these are the simplest forms of sugars. They're one organic molecule. And then anywhere from 3 to 7 carbon atoms. So if it's 5 carbon atoms in the molecule, we would call it a pentose, right? Or penta is 5. 6 carbons in the molecule, we call it hexose, which means 6. So an example of a hexose is glucose. Glucose is a 6 carbon molecule. So some other monosaccharides, glucose we mentioned, ribose in RNA, deoxyribose in DNA, fructose and galactose. These are all monosaccharides. So here's an image of glucose. You can see the 6 carbons. The carbons are numbered in clockwise, starting from where the oxygen is. So you see there's the oxygen. This would be carbon 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then notice that the 6th carbon is not part of the chain. It comes off the 5th carbon. Sorry, not part of the ring. It comes off the 5th carbon. Okay, and notice also that the OH groups and the H groups are not all on the same plane. And this is one way of drawing it. And then sometimes you see it drawn in a simplified version over here. The formula C6H12O6, you probably know that because we had to learn it when we studied cellular respiration. That requires glucose. Okay, so those were the monosaccharides. And then if we put 2 of those monosaccharides together, we get a disaccharide. It makes sense. Di means two. Now, the reactions that are required for forming disaccharides or for breaking down a disaccharide into monosaccharides, the reactions are the same for all the organic molecules we're going to look at. So let's look at this example. We've got two glucose molecules. There's going to be a reaction where they're going to join together to form a disaccharide called maltose. Now, in order for that bond to form, the OH group on one glucose is going to bond with the hydrogen from the adjacent glucose, and those two are going to break off and they're going to form H2O. So you see H2O over here as the other product of this reaction. So because water is being lost in this reaction, one way of describing this reaction is a dehydration reaction, losing water. The opposite process of breaking down a disaccharide is a hydrolysis reaction, which means we're adding water. So the hydro refers to the adding of water, and the lysis means splitting. So it's like adding water and splitting the molecule up. You know, another word for dehydration reaction that you might see is condensation synthesis. It means the same thing as a dehydration reaction. And whether we're talking about amino acids forming proteins, or monosaccharides forming disaccharides, or whether we're talking about lipids or nucleic acids, those are the four types of organic molecules we're going to look at. It's always a condensation synthesis or dehydration reaction to form polymers, and it's always a hydrolysis reaction to break those polymers down into monomers. So you'll see these words over and over again as we move through this unit. One delicious disaccharide that you know of is table sugar. The table sugar is sucrose, which is a disaccharide formed from a condensation synthesis reaction between glucose and fructose. Okay. Notice fructose is a 5 sides to the ring in fructose. So we've looked at monosaccharides and disaccharides. The third type of carbohydrate we're going to look at, what you might call a complex carbohydrate, are polysaccharides. And poly means many. So these are long polymers that contain many glucose subunits. We're going to look at 3 different kinds. We're going to look at starch, which is the storage form of glucose in plants. Right? So we get a lot of starch when we eat certain foods like potatoes. And we can break the starch up. We have an enzyme in our saliva called amylase, which can take that starch and break it down into glucose. We also have an amylase coming in our pancreas as well. We'll talk about that when we study digestion. Okay, but we can digest starch. Glycogen is the storage form of glucose in animals. So we are animals, and when we eat glucose, our cells might use some of that glucose right away for energy, right? But we also might store some of that glucose away for later. We store it in our liver mostly, and also in our muscles. And we store it as glycogen, and then when we need it, our liver will break down that glycogen back into glucose, so that we're able to keep our blood sugar at a steady level. And finally, cellulose. And cellulose, as I mentioned before, is found in the cell walls of plants. Okay, we cannot digest cellulose. So when we eat plants, the cellulose just passes right through us. And we're talking about cellulose in our diet, we usually use the word fiber. Okay. Some animals can digest cellulose, as you might know, like cows or termites or other animals that eat plants. And in those cases, they actually have other organisms that live in their gut that help to break down the cellulose for them. So these are the 3 polysaccharides that we're going to focus on in grade 12. And here's some images of them, a little bit hard to see, but the first one up here is the starch. And you'll notice that it's sort of a spiral-shaped molecule. It's branched, but it's also kind of a spiral-shaped. Okay. And that, again, is how plants store energy. And also in plants, down here we have the cellulose, which is in their cell wall. And this is linear. And it's linear, but you'll see how these linear strands are all clustered together in these cellulose fibers. And the third kind is the glycogen, which is how animals store glucose in liver. There's a picture of a liver. And also in muscles. And you'll notice that it is many branches here. Many branches. And so if we're going to if this is going to be broken down into glucose monosaccharides, what kind of reaction is that going to be? It's going to be a hydrolysis reaction, like we talked about earlier.